Hello. In 8 major areas, the President Xi Jinping promises to invest another $60 billion to assist the development of Africa based on the same amount of investment 3 years ago in Johannesburg. African leadership shares the same vision about the rejuvenation and sustainability of the regional economy with the help of China, which is wrestling with the downward pressure of its own growth. Beijing not only helps with infrastructure, but promises to build corporate governance to effectively utilize the rich human resources. President Xi's keynote presentation at the opening ceremony of FOCAC in Beijing 2018 showcases the bilateral consensus that co-prosperity through the Belt and Road Initiative will make a big difference in alleviating poverty and in fostering Africa's industrialization. Joining me in the Beijing studio are Madam He Wenping, Hannah Ryder from Africa, and Jill Reid from France. Welcome to our discussion here. Obviously, this is the third major diplomatic event that China hosts in the year 2018. What can you tell the global audience about the Chinese ambition?
Ever since the last year, November, the Party Congress, President Xi Jinping has made one statement which impressed me very much. He said now, after this 40 years reform and opening up, China now is moving to the center of the world stage. So while we are moving to the center of the world stage, of course, we are also shouldering the increasing this responsibility for pay our contribution to this global governance. So for those three big events we are hosting this year, I think this China-African Summit is going to be the most shining one. So you see, we are welcoming a lot of the heads of states from Africa. So I think this is a brilliant thing. Also, we also show this consistency of our policy, that is to further strengthen our ties with Africa and hand in hand together to moving to this shared future, this prosperity, common prosperity. It's not saying China developed and then we just left behind our African brothers and sisters. So we are still, mutually serving the engines for our economic growth.
Is it exaggeration to say, Hannah, that the rest of the international observers, particularly those in the West, in Washington, are holding their breath, following what's going on in Beijing, given the jewel of the crown in China's proactive diplomacy, and this one, the multilateral diplomatic conference that brings heads of state from over 50 African countries, including senior officials from African Union. Now, what does that mean for you, someone who comes from Africa?
Well, there's been a lot of attention on the China-Africa relationship as this summit comes to being. It's a summit it's a relationship which has been ongoing. FOCAC has been ongoing for 18 years now. There was some high expectations, but also at the same time, some warning signs. People worrying that African countries are taking too much debt, for example. Now, my response to that as an African is we need to take more debt. We need more debt from everybody, actually. We need more external financing. We need infrastructure, estimated at least $130 billion over the next few years. So, therefore, what China is able to contribute through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is very welcome and will continue to be welcome over the next 18 years going forward as well.
Debt-driven growth for Africa is no major issue for Hannah, but it's the alleged debt trap that matters to those who comes up with the conspiracy theory that China wants to enslave African development. What do you make of their concerns?
Well, if you look at debt, I totally agree with Hannah. I spend half of my time traveling Africa and saying Africa wants more debt. The debt trap is by far not very close, especially if you compare to the debt which you have in all those countries which are claiming that Africa should have no debt. That's the first point. The second point is that if you look at debt is only one part of financing. One should look at the other side, which is investment. The FDI, the foreign direct investment, has gone way above the aid. And the last point is that debt is something related to investment, to transformation, to rejuvenation, to modernization. And what's very interesting with this forum, with the China-Africa Forum, is that it's talking long-term. And the African Union leaders have mentioned that. They've mentioned that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is about investment and partly debt, is aligning more and more with the 2063 agenda, which is the long, far-fetching horizon for rejuvenation of the African continent. So if there's one place in this world where we're talking long-term, it's here in Beijing these days. And when you're thinking long-term with a vision, one should not worry too much with the short-term effects of that.
At the same time, the Chinese observers are clearly aware that this unprecedented scale of industrialization in Africa happens on the U.S. watch. And therefore, President Xi Jinping says, we refuse to interfere with the internal affairs of Africa, and he gives 5 no in his opening remarks. Now, can you elaborate a little bit the centerpiece that President Xi Jinping presented?
Oh yes, again, I'm very impressed by those 3 no's because it's
5 no's, in fact.
Oh, 5 no's, yes, giving a very strong determination to when he pressed these 5 no's. So all those 5 no's, like stand on our own past principles. Those principles like not interference other countries' domestic issue, not trying to influence like African countries their own choice for choosing their development model, and not give any influence to any decisions they're trying to make by themselves, and also not
no political strings.
Yeah, no strings attached for our development assistance, and also not trying to gain any political selfish interest from all our cooperation with Africa. So no those extra, those some personal, selfish, some interest things we're considering when we're doing economic cooperation with Africa. So those 5 no's has been made very clear that China's approach, China's engagement model with Africa is totally different with other countries, especially some Western countries' approach with Africa, because their conditionality, like while they are providing development assistance, they are always like trying to influence other countries this development model choosing. Even the recently State Secretary Pompeo has made clearly in one speech, I think last month, he said, now we are trying to bring Africa into the track we are now guiding, use the America's model, America's way. So we will chase away the Chinese, the influence. He made that in a public speech. So that's not our approach. Yeah, we are saying Africa themselves, they are wise enough to choose their own development model. Nobody else except the African country, African people that knows their own national conditions better. They knows what kind of way should themselves better. No others knows that.
Yes, Hannah, go ahead.
I agree with that. And I think what's also, at the same time, it's also important to emphasize that, yes, the Chinese model of engagement is different. But what's really great to see, especially here at hearing some of the speeches from South Africa, from Rwanda, is that there is also a real desire for much more African agency with regard to all of its relationships, whether it's China, with the US or others. So, of course, there's always room for improvement, and what we've seen here is new topics being put onto the agenda, and in particular with regards to trade facilitation. Now, trade facilitation is really important in the context of China-Africa relationships. 40 out of 53 of the countries with diplomatic relationships with China have a trade deficit with China. They want to address that, and what was great to see was President Xi, in some of his initiatives today, really saying we will work to help and work with African countries to make that trade deficit issue change. And that is a response to the African side. So there's room for improvement, and I hope that FOCAC can continue in that fashion, hearing much more of the African voice coming forward.
We're ready to listen. Let's take a closer look at what the Americans are so concerned about regarding our collaboration with Africa. They say in the end of statement that the governance is the key word in their vocabulary. For example, they are worried about the corruption and the ability for some of the African elites to run the economy. So in the wake of the Cold War, many African economists have adopted a liberal democracy, market economy, But why do most of them fail to pick up as quickly as the American government expects? So China says that's their choice. We just pursue the principle of co-prosperity based on mutual respect, non-interference. What do you think of the American concerns?
Well, you know,
and the Europeans share much of the same concerns.
I think governance is a concern which is shared by everyone, starting from Africa. Governance is not just a buzzword coming from one part of the world. It's a general human concern across societies. Now, governance needs measurement, needs figures, data, and systems. And what was interesting, and I would emphasize on what has been said here, is that on the very practical suggestions that were made today, large initiatives, large philosophical movements, but also very practical measures. One was actually geared towards customs, simplifying the customs, making the customs more transparent. That's governance. That's the beginning, that's the root of governance as far as we're talking non-interference, as far as we're talking about the international community and about the globalization. The root of globalization is trade, and if trade is measured, if customs are improved, that's great. And that's very important for China, that's very important for Africa, but that's also and for the bilateral trade, but that's very important internally to Africa. One should notice that this year is the year when the free trade zone has been signed, the continental trade zone.
A few days ahead of the opening ceremony of FOCAC in Beijing 2018, Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi made the announcement that China has been able to execute all of the 10 cooperation plans with Africa that President Xi Jinping raised 3 years ago in Johannesburg. Which one has impressed you most among the 10-point proposals?
I think 2 areas has impressed me very much, because I also, during the past 3 years, I traveled to a number of African countries and I had those chances to see those projects going on by myself. So one is infrastructure building. A lot of railway now either has been finished already in operation, like Mombasa and Nairobi Railway, and Djibouti and Addis Ababa Railway, and others also in the process of construction. So all of this has offered like a very strong basis for industrialization takeoff. This has been made very clear even by the Kenya President Uhuru Kenyatta. So when he himself, being the first passenger, took that trip from the Mombasa to Nairobi, he made that Twitter publicly, saying this is the day now for laid the foundation for Kenya's industrial takeoff. So this has cut the cost for those transportation, and also save this timing, for moving the goods flow and the people flow. Another is the industrial park and those special economic zone. So industrial park has been building in Africa all over the world. According to a very preliminary survey, there are at least 100 different size of those industrial park now has been established, either has been sponsored by Chinese government or by the provincial government, or even by some enterprises themselves. Those companies, they build on those industrial park, trying to to make it larger for luring some other Chinese companies to settle in. So this is also offered a cluster, those industrial transfer from Chinese company moving to the African continent. This exactly similar like 40 years ago. So when China opened our door and take off the reform and the opening, by that time, like our labor country, Japan, like Singapore, those countries, they all come in and also settle in the factory and then in our industrial park and special economic zone, and then eventually through this learning by doing in those economic zone and industrial park. So we gradually got to know this technical know-how, and gradually our
in 1992, late senior leader Deng Xiaoping said in his southern tour of Shenzhen, China, entrepreneurs in China should be encouraged to experiment with capitalism through the establishment of special economic zones. Now, having said this, I was impressed by a quote by President Kenyatta of Kenya, which is the location of the African Union. He said, years ago when the white people came, they came with the Bible. We had the land, but we closed the eyes. When we opened the eyes, they took the land. We have the Bible. Now, what does he mean?
I think what he means is that colonialism was a really difficult and horrible structure to be to have to go through. What he means is that African countries no longer, have gone through that process. They now need to focus on their own growth.
I just came back from South Africa, right? Article 25 of the South African Constitution caused a lot of policy debates concerning land reform and the land redistribution. Based on the fears of what happened in Zimbabwe, white farmers were deprived of their land, and the white people in South Africa are obsessively concerned that the same might happen in South Africa. So what President Kenyatta said actually implied the concerns that land and land reform, redistribution, constitute the centerpiece of perhaps the legacy of colonialism, some of which might be considered good by elites of some of the African governments. You cannot comprehensively reject all the legacies of the European experiences in shaping their governance. So what do you think of land reform and the very controversial consequences arising from Zimbabwe?
Well, it's true that many African countries have a diverse, mixed history, and there are mixed societies today in terms of ethnicities, in terms of access to land, but to other resources as well. I think there's a long-term progress, and there's a kind of a silent revolution. In some places, it's not very silent. In most of the continent, most parts of the continent, there's a silent revolution. Even if you look in countries where most of the land is owned by the native people, you have disparity in access. Land reform is very important in Western Africa as well. In Western Africa, there was no land colonization. Still, it's a very key reform. And I think that cooperation on the agriculture side with China, because China has modernized its agriculture pretty well, is also a way to redistribute. You redistribute in an easier way when the productivity is bigger.
Ray, you put your finger on a very interesting point concerning agricultural production. Exactly 40 years ago, Wenping, because this year we see the 40th anniversary of China's opening up. It's what we said, 农村包围城市. Our modernization campaign was inaugurated from the rural areas where the family responsibility system was adopted by farmers in their millions. When we look at what kind of inspirations we can draw from each other, President Xi Jinping said in one of his 8 initiatives that agricultural collaboration, irrigation systems need to be strengthened and constructed across the border in Africa. Is it a very good piece of advice?
Oh, of course. I think President Xi, because he has gone through all his experience serving first. He
himself went to Africa 9 times, and when he became president, he went to Africa 4 times, South Africa 3 times.
Yes. So he knew the African situation also pretty well. He also, of course, knew China's situation much better, because he first served as the head of a village, and then gradually moving up, to the county. And
in the most impoverished province of Shanxi.
Yes, and also that's why the second book of his book is called Anti-Poverty. The first book is on the governance idea. So in terms of this anti-poverty experience, of course, China has a very right and this capacity to talk about, to share our experience. Like you mentioned, there's a household responsibility system, and also like irrigation system, and how to help those farmers to join called the township enterprises. Yeah, you no need to rush all the way to the big cities, and then you will see the big slums everywhere. But there's no need. They just go nearby and to find a job. No longer so get those.
Exactly on the primary stage of China's initial development since 40 years ago, township enterprises form the unique horizon, skyline of China's reform, particularly the non-public sector and their boom in the coastal provinces, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Guangdong, Fujian. The miracles of their success have impressed and wowed the whole world. So what do you think of in this area of collaboration in terms of what you might consider more interesting, the building of infrastructure?
Well, I think infrastructure is crucial to agricultural modernization. It's crucial to industrial parks. You can't have an industrial park without water supply, energy supply, and so on. So infrastructure is the bedrock, as it were. And so again, that's why the financing is crucial. It's also why the continued commitment of China towards industrial parks is very important. And my hope is that also the foreign direct investment from Chinese investors, we're constantly working with African governments who really want to actively promote their countries to Chinese investors. They want to bring in more and more foreign direct investment. And today we heard a commitment to at least 10 billion over the next 3 years. That would take China's volume of foreign direct investment, stock of foreign direct investment in Africa, to around UK, France, US levels. However, hopefully there'll be even more than that, and that foreign direct investment can go into agricultural machinery, which can have a transformative effect, for example, on the ability of people to get higher yields, learning from China.
Certainly the
so on.
10 collaboration plans that President Xi Jinping raised 3 years ago in Johannesburg, and the 8 initiatives that he came up this time around at the opening ceremony would all help China further integrated with the rest of Africa and to comprehensively engage the land or continent which is known for rich human resources and natural resources. One powerful measure that the Chinese authorities introduced this time around in Beijing through FOCAC is to grant 50,000 government scholarships and to bring 1,000 elites from African governments for the training programs. Human resources, do you think they constitute the free movement of human capital as part of the globalization that China facilitates on our term?
Training is extremely important. It's important at the cultural level to understand each other. That's the first thing. But it's also important to modernize the economy, because the economy is changing very fast. On infrastructure, I think we are heading towards success. It's ambition-based on success already. So what will be the key now will be the next wave, the next frontier. The next frontier will be more diverse investment through the private companies, the private firms from China, the joint ventures between African companies and Chinese companies. And that needs much more discussion, much more negotiation, much more understanding through the human resource. So I think it's very important, and training is preparing the next wave of diversification of the relationships between the two zones in the world. I think it's extremely key, and I think it's what also the continent wants. The many initiatives were launched by the continent itself, the next Einstein Forum, for instance, promoting science. So I think it's a very welcome move from China.
I've had a wide range of discussions with the local South Africans during our 11-day stay there. And one of the issues we spend much time discussing is the approval or enacting the BE, the Black People Empowerment Act. That's the African equivalent of the Affirmative Act in the United States to ensure proportion of representation, proportional representation, meaning in the company you've got to have enough black people to sound politically correct and to ensure full employment in the job market. But the white people in South Africa complained bitterly that many of the black Africans are ill-educated. They cannot live up to the standards of the corporate governance. In that way, they trust the white people more than the local black people. Do you think this is a matter of racial discrimination or the legacy of that old era, or is this a realistic concern for a better form of governance?
Well, I think it's a combination. All those elements now has been combined and then has been released from that exit is called a racial problem. Actually, after the apartheid regime has been ended, and the great leader Nelson Mandela, he has been the scar has been covered. That is a racial problem He said, I want people throw your guns, throw your hatreds to the sea. Even himself saying, I forgive all those
jailers.
Yeah, those jailers.
Who put him into the prison.
Yeah, in the prison for 27 years long. So, but you know, all those things is not completely over yet. When this economic situation getting, you know, deteriorated, when those unemployment.
But look at how Jack Zuma
youth,
fell disgracefully from the power center stage. Corruption threatens to erode the credibility of ANC. Do you think the legacy of Nelson Mandela has been diminished and compromised?
Oh yes, that's for sure.
Over 2 decades after the end of apartheid.
Yeah, his legacy has been diminished. But doesn't mean Mandela's way has been doing now is completely wrong. I totally against that idea, saying Mandela, oh, his way is just to cover all those, you know, those problems, hasn't resolved them, any of them. But there's only way to make that country, you know, transition smoothly. Otherwise, all those problems maybe show up much earlier. And then we even couldn't enjoy. South Africa has been gone through in a very good shape, at least after 1994 up to now. But all those problems, I think, tricked off from those economic bad management. This is also again coming from the global economic downturn. And in South Africa, they couldn't make a very good transition from the past economic structure, especially those industrial structure is lag behind already, but they cannot keep the pace with the new round of this new industrial revolution.
One of the major 8 initiatives President Xi Jinping raised at the opening ceremony of FOCAC 2018 in Beijing is peace and security. With the end of the Cold War, peace and development remain the 2 major themes for the United Nations. By the way, General Secretary of the United Nations, Guterres, also delivered a keynote presentation. So what do you think of our policy option to send blue helmet troops to Somali waters? No, not in that case. We fight piracy and escort the oil tanks there. But we fight terrorism, extremism, and the piracy. We help maintain peace there. Ray, what do you think of the Chinese presence in this regard?
I think it's important it becomes a shared issue, a truly shared issue. So any country in the world willing to contribute, I think is welcome, and is welcome by the continent itself. This being said, development is the key issue, and again back to what's the heart of the FOCAC.
In doing that, do you think China is able to prevent asylum seekers who cross the Mediterranean and go to Italy, Turkey,
is able to
Germany,
stabilize some regions, yes, to contribute to stabilization.
Italians expect China to do something.
I think poverty is at the core of these issues. So every contribution from China, from all other partners to addressing poverty in the region contributes to making sure that people don't feel that they need to flee from their countries. People prefer to be in their own countries, of course. At the same time, we still do need open borders, and that push should not stop. You know, what China's doing with the suggestion of, you know, extra scholarships and so on, it's bringing more people here, more trade, more bringing, supporting African businesses like mine to flourish here in China. This has to continue, and I hope that China will actually continue to show that, will start to show that it is at the forefront of that effort of both supporting poverty reduction in Africa, but also being open to Africans.
This is indeed a major task of China's international responsibility, which is growing in size and scale. As one of the P5 of the United Nations, thank you so much for your participation in this dialogue on the FOCAC Summit in Beijing. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.